This is the macabre history of the Ravenscroft family. The road to Ravenscroft Manor was little more than a winding scar across the moors, beaten thin by centuries of cartwheels and hooves. It cut through a landscape of heather and mist, where crows perched on skeletal trees and watched every traveler with glassy eyes that seemed far too knowing. Jonathan Hale, a scholar of antiquities who had traveled from London at the behest of the Historical Society, pulled his cloak tighter as the evening fog thickened, swallowing both road and horizon. His carriage wheels groaned over stones slick. With dew, the horses restless as though they sensed something that he did not. The villagers he had questioned at the last coaching inn had given him little more than half-truths and sidelong glances. Some muttered prayers when he mentioned the manor's name. Others changed the subject with unnatural haste. Yet the Society's letter had been clear. He was to catalogue the Ravenscroft Library, a collection said to be among the rarest in Europe. Rumor whispered of illuminated manuscripts penned by monks driven to madness, of grimoires bound in human skin, of treatises on forbidden sciences. For a man whose livelihood was the uncovering of relics, the assignment was irresistible. As the carriage crested a rise, the manor emerged from the fog like a beast roused from slumber. Its towers clawed at the sky, windows aglow with faint light though no smoke rose from the chimneys. Gargoyles crouched along the roofline, their stone jaws wet with mist, their eyes gleaming as if they too watched his approach. The vast front, gates, wrought iron twisted into raven motifs, stood half open as though expecting him. The driver muttered something under his breath and would go no further. Jonathan descended alone, his boots sinking into the wet earth. The gates groaned at his touch, and he stepped into the shadow of the estate. The courtyard stretched wide and uneven, cobblestones cracked by roots, the fountain at its center long dry but stained dark as though something thicker than water had once flowed there. A chill crawled up his spine, though the air was not cold. The door opened before he could lift the knocker. A woman stood there, her figure tall and elegant, her gown black as morning silk. Her hair, dark as raven feathers, fell in waves around a face too pale to belong to the living or the well. Her eyes, gray and unblinking, studied him with a mixture of curiosity and something colder. "Mr. Hale," she said, her voice soft but echoing faintly, as though the hall behind her repeated her words. "We have been expecting you." He bowed slightly, unsettled by her presence, yet unable to name why. She introduced herself as Lady Ravenscroft, the current mistress of the estate, and gestured for him to follow. The great hall was dim, lit only by candelabras whose flames bent as though in a draught that could not be felt. Portraits lined the walls, each bearing faces of past Ravenscrofts, their eyes painted so vividly they seemed to follow him. One in particular, a stern man in dark robes clutching a book bound in iron clasps, made Jonathan's steps falter. The air inside was heavy, carrying a faint metallic tang that reminded him of old coins or blood. Tapestries hung from the walls. Their colors faded, their woven scenes of hunts and feasts more grotesque upon closer inspection, antlered men being pursued by hounds, banquet tables laid with human limbs mistaken at first glance for roasted game. He blinked, certain his eyes deceived him. But when he looked again, the images seemed perfectly ordinary. Lady Ravenscroft led him to the library, a vast chamber whose vaulted ceiling disappeared into shadow. Rows upon rows of shelves stretched into darkness, filled with tomes whose spines were cracked and whose titles glimmered faintly in gilt lettering. The smell of leather, dust, and something older filled the air. At the center of the room stood a desk carved of ebony, its surface scarred with symbols Jonathan did not recognize. "This is the task before you," she said, gesturing to the endless shelves, "to give order to the chaos our ancestors have left behind. But I warn you, Mr. Hale, the books have a will of their own. Handle them with respect. and they may grant you knowledge. Treat them carelessly, and—" Her words trailed off, but the silence that followed spoke more than the warning. Jonathan forced a smile, telling himself it was nothing more than a wealthy family's eccentricity. He set his satchel on the desk and withdrew his tools, parchment, ink, and spectacles. Lady Ravenscroft left him then, her footsteps fading like whispers into the hall. Alone, he felt the weight of the library settle upon him, the silence pressing against his ears. He turned to the shelves, his fingers brushing the spines. Some were warm to the touch, others cold as stone. One pulsed faintly beneath his hand, like the beating of a heart. He snatched his fingers back, pulse quickening. A sound broke the silence, the faintest whisper, low and indistinct. He froze, listening. It came again, this time from higher on the shelves, a voice like wind through cracks in stone. He told himself it was the draft, yet the syllables were too deliberate, too shaped. He climbed a small ladder and reached for the source, a book bound in blackened leather, clasped with tarnished silver. The whisper ceased the moment his hand closed around it. Descending carefully, he placed the volume on the desk. Its cover bore no title, only a symbol etched into the hide, a raven, wings spread, its talons clutching a bleeding heart. He hesitated, then undid the clasp. The air seemed to shiver as the cover opened. Inside, the pages were filled with ink so dark it glistened like wet tar, the script jagged and sharp, as though the writer's hand had trembled with violence. At the top of the first page, a name stared back at him in ornate script. Alaric Ravenscroft. The words blurred, then seemed to shift, aligning themselves into language he could understand. Against all reason, he began to read, and the tale of the founder unfolded in ink that seemed to seep and writhe as his eyes traced each line. It spoke of bargains struck in moonlit crypts, of offerings buried beneath roots twisted in unnatural shapes, of whispers carried by black-feathered messengers that perched upon his windowsill. It spoke of a promise sealed in blood, a covenant, that bound not only Alaric but every Ravenscroft born after him. Jonathan's breath came shallow, his fingers trembling against the parchment. A sudden gust extinguished half the candles, plunging the library into shadow. From somewhere deep within the shelves came the faint flutter of wings, though no bird should have been there. He turned slowly, heart hammering, as the whispering began again, louder this time, dozens of voices rising and falling, threading through the air like a chorus of the damned. The ink on the page seemed to pulse like a vein, every letter alive, every word carrying the weight of centuries. Jonathan's eyes burned, yet he could not look away. The tale within spoke of Alaric Ravenscroft, the first of the name to lay claim to the manor. He was not born to nobility, but to obscurity, a man of restless ambition who clawed his way from anonymity by means not meant for mortal hands. It began with the famine of 1623, when the moors were barren and the rivers ran thin. Villagers starved, children wasted away, and Alaric, then but a minor scribe, faced ruin like all others. Yet he was different. Where others prayed for mercy, he sought power. The pages described him wandering alone to the marshes under the blood moon, carrying a raven's carcass and a blade of silver. At the heart of the marsh, where the reeds grew black and the water reeked of decay, he carved strange sigils into the mud, each one dripping with his own blood. He called out, not to God, but to something older, something nameless, his voice echoing across the desolate expanse. The book claimed, the marsh answered. From the fog rose a figure cloaked in feathers, its face hidden beneath a mask of bone. It spoke without speaking, promising abundance, dominion, and a legacy that would stretch beyond death itself. The bargain was simple. Alaric's bloodline would prosper, but every generation must feed the pact. Offerings would be required, flesh, devotion, and silence. In return, the Ravencrofts would rise above kings and parliaments. Jonathan read of how, within days of the ritual, the famine seemed to lift around Alaric's estate. His fields ripened, his livestock thrived, while neighboring farms withered. Starving villagers came to him for grain, and in exchange for food he demanded loyalty. Within a decade, he had built both fortune and fear, cementing his claim to the land where Ravencroft Manor would soon stand. But prosperity was not the only fruit of his bargain. Shadows began to gather around his family. His wife Eleanor was said to have wasted away in her bed, her body pale and her lips blackened as though poisoned by unseen hands. His firstborn son was born with eyes the color of coal, refusing to cry even once, and died before his 5th winter. Yet Alaric showed no grief. The manuscript described him descending nightly into a cellar chamber built beneath the house's foundations. There he lit candles of tallow, spread bones upon the floor in intricate patterns, and spoke words that cracked the silence like glass. Servants whispered that they heard wings beating against the stones, though no birds could enter. The book detailed a particular night when Alaric gathered the villagers for what he called a feast of Thanksgiving. The harvest had been bountiful, and the manor's hall groaned under the weight of roasted meats and flowing wine. Yet those who attended claimed that after the feast began, the doors locked themselves. Guests vanished one by one, their laughter silenced by screams muffled behind stone walls. When morning came, the tables were cleared, and Alaric walked among the survivors with a smile, though none could recall how the night had ended. Jonathan felt the air in the library grow heavier as he read, the flames of the remaining candles bending as though pushed by unseen breath. The ink on the page shimmered, the words forming not only Alaric's deeds but his voice, as if the founder himself whispered across the centuries. The blood sustains, the blood binds. To falter is to perish. To obey is to reign. He slammed the book shut, breath ragged, sweat dampening his collar. The room fell silent, yet the echo of the words lingered like the toll of a bell. He told himself it was only a story, a myth crafted by mad hands. Yet he could not shake the sense that the walls themselves leaned closer to listen. A sound stirred behind him, soft but deliberate. He turned to see a child standing at the edge of the library, a girl no more than 8, with pale skin and dark hair that fell in tangled strands over her face. She watched him without blinking, her eyes gray and fathomless, the mark of a raven faintly visible at her throat. Jonathan opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, the girl raised a finger to her lips in silence. Then, without a sound, she turned and vanished into the corridor. Jonathan sat frozen, torn between chasing her and pretending she had never been there. The book still rested on the desk, its raven sigil glowing faintly as though mocking him. He told himself his task was only to catalog, only to record. Yet deep inside, he knew the truth. He had already stepped too far into the history of the Ravencrofts, and whatever pact had been forged in the marshes had not ended with Alaric. It was alive, it was waiting, and it had marked him the moment he entered the manor. The night settled thick around Ravencroft Manor. The moors outside swallowed in fog so dense the world seemed to end beyond the gates. Jonathan had retired to the guest chamber given to him, though retired was generous, for sleep refused to claim him. The mattress beneath him sagged like an open grave, and the drapes stirred though the windows were shut. Somewhere in the walls he heard it again, the whispering. At first it was faint, like wind caught in the cracks of stone, but as he listened, the sounds grew distinct, voices overlapping in hushed tones. He could not make out words, only the cadence, as though a gathering of unseen speakers conspired just beyond reach. Unable to endure the silence of the room, he lit a candle and stepped into the corridor. The air was colder there, the stones beneath his feet damp with a moisture that had no earthly source. Shadows clung stubbornly to the corners, moving against the flicker of his flame. He told himself it was nothing, tricks of the eye, the mind rebelling against solitude. Yet as he passed the portraits, their painted eyes seemed alive with something more than pigment. pupils gleaming as though following him through the halls. He turned a corner and found himself in a wing he had not explored earlier. The architecture was wrong, the angles slightly crooked, the ceilings sloping in ways no craftsman would design. His candlelight caught carvings etched into the stone, nearly invisible unless sought. Symbols like ravens in flight, spirals coiled into infinity, marks that seemed to breathe when studied too long. At the end of the corridor stood a door, heavy oak banded with iron, half concealed by tattered draperies. The whispering grew louder. Jonathan swallowed hard, each step forward feeling like a choice he could not undo. He pressed his hand against the iron latch, surprised to find it warm to the touch, and the door yielded without protest. Inside was a narrow chamber lit by a single oil lamp that burned without smoke. Dust coated the floor, disturbed only by faint footprints too small for an adult's. Against the far wall stood a writing desk, upon which lay parchment curled with age. The ink upon it was fresh, though, black and wet, as though the hand that had written had only just departed. Jonathan leaned closer, his candle trembling. The page bore a list of names, villagers, merchants, even clergy, all struck through with crimson lines. At the bottom of the list, a final name stood unmarked. It was his own. A breath escaped him, shaky and cold. His candle sputtered. Behind him came the faint sound of a footstep, though the door had remained shut. He spun, but there was only the flicker of his flame and the slow sway of the draperies. Yet the whispering swelled now, no longer muffled but close, intimate, as if it rose from the very stones. He stumbled back into the corridor, the parchment clutched in his shaking hand, his candle nearly extinguished. The air pressed close, thick with the smell of damp earth and iron. From somewhere deeper in the manor, a child's laughter rang, sharp and fleeting, then vanished into silence. Jonathan's steps quickened. He did not know where he was going, only away from that cursed chamber. But the manor was not merciful. The halls seemed to shift, leading him in circles, each turn familiar yet wrong. He passed the same portrait thrice. A woman with hollow eyes, her painted lips curved in a smile that deepened with every glance. The candle burned lower, the wax spilling onto his skin, but he dared not let it go dark. At last, he burst into the great hall, chest heaving, the parchment still crumpled in his fist. The candles there flared to life as though stirred by unseen hands, and Lady Ravenscroft stood at the far end, her face half-shadowed. She regarded him calmly, as though his panic were expected, perhaps even desired. "You have begun to hear them," she said softly, her voice carrying through the cavernous space. "The walls remember, Mr. Hale. They do not keep secrets. They repeat them." Jonathan tried to speak, to demand an explanation, but his voice faltered. He opened his hand and revealed the parchment. Lady Ravenscroft's eyes flicked to it briefly, then returned to him. Her expression betrayed no surprise. "Every guest finds their name eventually," she murmured. "The house shows you what you need to see. The question, Mr. Hale, is not why your name is there, but whether it will be struck through." Her words lingered in the silence that followed, heavy and immovable, as the whispers in the walls rose once more louder than ever, and the candle in Jonathan's hand guttered as though ready to die. Jonathan barely slept after that encounter, though he never left the hall until morning's weak light began to filter through the stained glass windows. He must have dozed in a chair near the long table, for when he opened his eyes, the candelabras were cold and empty, and the grand room was silent save for the creak of old beams. Lady Ravenscroft was gone, leaving him to wonder if their conversation had been real at all, or some phantasm conjured by exhaustion. Yet the parchment with the list of names still rested in his coat pocket, its ink dark and accusing, his own name scrawled at the bottom. Driven by both fear and compulsion, Jonathan returned to the library at dawn. The air there was heavier than before, thick with dust that swirled in the dim light. He found the black volume where he had left it, though he could not recall closing it. The raven sigil on its cover gleamed faintly, as though mocking him, daring him to look again. He resisted, choosing instead to turn his attention to other tomes. Many were harmless enough, histories of kings, maps of forgotten lands, philosophical discourses, but tucked among them were volumes darker, bound in hides that did not feel like any leather he had ever touched, their ink so red it could not be dye. He opened one at random and found a series of diagrams, circles intersecting, lines converging into patterns that resembled both celestial maps and cages. At the margins, notes were scrawled in a jagged hand. To open is to invite. To seal is to starve. The offering must be willing. He recoiled, heart thudding, and shut the book. But as he turned, he saw her again, the child. She stood at the threshold of the library, her pale face calm, her gray eyes unreadable. The faint raven-shaped mark at her throat seemed darker in the morning light. She said nothing, only pointed to the shelves behind him. When Jonathan turned, he saw one book half drawn from its place, as though waiting. When he turned back, the girl was gone. The volume she had indicated was slim, bound in cracked brown leather. Inside was no treatise nor diary, but a chronicle, handwritten, recounting events of a century past. Jonathan read of Eleanor Ravenscroft, a young bride who vanished on her wedding night. The writer described her laughter, her beauty, her devotion, until the night of the ceremony, when she was led away to the chamber below. Guests reported hearing her screams, muffled and frantic, but no one dared intervene. By dawn, the chamber was sealed, and Eleanor was never seen again. The chronicle ended abruptly, the last words smeared as if written in haste. She feeds the pact now. She was chosen. Jonathan closed the book with trembling hands. His throat was dry, his mind reeling with questions. Was this merely myth, or had the Ravenscrofts truly sacrificed their own? He thought of the whispering in the walls, the laughter in the night, the shifting halls. Perhaps the manor itself was not haunted by spirits, but by the memory of blood given too freely. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Lady Ravenscroft summoned him to dine. The hall was lit with golden lamps, their glow warm against the vast shadows. Platters of roasted meats and goblets of wine filled the table, though Jonathan noted he had not seen a single servant prepare them. She sat at the head poised and elegant, her pale hands folded upon the table. "You've begun to see what lingers here," she said, her voice smooth, almost kind. "The manor does not reveal itself to everyone, only those it chooses. That should tell you something of your place in this story." Jonathan tried to mask his unease with questions. The chronicles speak of Eleanor Ravenscroft. She disappeared. Was she murdered? Lady Ravenscroft's eyes glimmered in the candlelight. Disappearance is a matter of perspective. What is taken from the world above may serve a purpose below. Do you think our legacy has endured by chance, Mr. Hale? Do you think fortunes fall from the sky? No. They are earned, bargained for, and fed. Her words chilled him, but he forced himself to hold her gaze. And do the whispers I hear belong to those who were fed? A thin smile curved her lips. She raised her goblet, red wine glinting like blood. Perhaps. Or perhaps they are the promises of those who came before you. The house remembers, and the pact is never silent. Jonathan barely touched his meal, though hunger gnawed at him. The roasted meats looked ordinary, but their texture under his knife was too soft, their scent too rich, and he found he could not bring himself to taste them. Lady Ravenscroft ate delicately, every gesture graceful, but her eyes never left him. Later, as he returned to his chamber, Jonathan felt the manor breathing again, the groan of its timbers, the sigh of its stones, the pulse in its air. He thought of Eleanor, of her laughter silenced beneath the foundations, and of Alaric's bargain written in blood. He lay awake on the sagging bed, staring into the shadows, waiting for the whispers to begin anew. The night bled slowly into silence, but Jonathan found no rest. His mind replayed the words of Lady Ravenscroft, her calm acceptance of sacrifice, her veiled pride in a legacy bought with terror. The whispers returned as the hour grew late, threads of voices winding through the walls until they pressed against his ears like cold fingers. He tried to ignore them, tried to pretend they were no more than drafts slipping through cracks of the ancient stones, but denial faltered when he heard his name whispered among them. Jonathan. The sound was faint, Stretched thin, but it was unmistakable. He sat up sharply, his candle nearly falling from the nightstand. The darkness seemed heavier, thick as a living thing, and he could not shake the sense that unseen eyes lingered above his bed. He rose, lighting a second candle from the stub that had burned low, and followed the voices into the corridor. The manor guided him, its halls reshaping themselves like a maze designed for prey. At last he found himself at the base of a staircase he had not noticed before, spiraling downward into the depths beneath the house. The air grew colder with each step, until his breath clouded before him. The staircase ended at a stone archway leading into a subterranean chamber. Here the air was damp and metallic, tinged with iron and rot. Rows of torches burned low in sconces along the walls, though Jonathan could not say who had lit them. The floor was marked with symbols carved deep into the stone, their grooves darkened with stains that looked too old to be fresh, too deep to ever wash away. At the chamber's center stood an altar, a massive block of black stone slick with age. Above it, the ceiling arched into darkness, but Jonathan swore he heard the rustling of wings far above. He approached cautiously, his candle trembling, and saw the remnants of what must have been rituals. Bowls crusted with dried blood, rusted chains bolted to the altar's sides, and feathers scattered across the floor. A low sound stirred in the chamber, not quite a whisper, not quite a growl. Jonathan froze, heart hammering. Then he saw it, shadows moving against the altar, coiling and stretching like smoke but thicker, as though with weight. They writhed and bent into forms almost human, their mouths opening in silent screams before melting back into darkness. Jonathan staggered back, nearly tripping over a loose stone. His candle guttered, and in its weak light he saw something worse, carvings on the altar itself. Names etched into the black stone, names he recognized from the parchment he still carried. Names of villagers, clergy, servants, and finally his own. Beneath his name, faint but waiting, was a space left unmarked. A voice broke the silence then, smooth and commanding. "You should not be here." Jonathan spun to find Lady Ravenscroft standing at the archway, her gown trailing across the damp floor, her expression unreadable. She seemed to glow faintly in the dim torchlight, her pale skin almost luminous. She stepped forward without hesitation, as though the chamber belonged to her alone. "You see now what sustains us," she continued, her eyes fixed upon him. "The pact is older than memory, and every generation has honored it. Alaric did not build this house upon stone alone. He built it upon devotion, sealed with blood. Without it, we are nothing." Jonathan's voice cracked as he forced words past his dry throat. You murder your own kin. Your wives, your children, your guests. All for this. For this madness?" Her gaze did not waver. "Madness?" "No. Purpose. You speak as one who has not tasted true power, Mr. Hale. Do you know why the Ravenscrofts endure when others fall? Why our name is whispered even when centuries pass? Because we gave ourselves to something greater. We feed the pact, and in return, the pact feeds us." She moved closer, her footsteps soundless on the stone floor. The shadows writhed more eagerly at her presence, as though they recognized her. Jonathan felt the weight of their gaze upon him, their hunger pressing into his bones. "You are here because the house chose you," she whispered. "The book opened for you. The whisper spoke your name. You cannot run from what you are now part of." Jonathan clutched the parchment tighter, its edges cutting into his skin. "I am not part of this. I came to record history, not become it." Lady Ravenscroft's lips curved in the faintest smile. "And yet history records you, Mr. Hale. Already your name is written. Already the pact has marked you." The torches flared then, casting the chamber into stark relief. Jonathan saw more now, bones piled in the corners, brittle and yellow, feathers black as pitch drifting from nowhere. The altar pulsed faintly, as though alive, and the shadows bent toward it like worshippers. He staggered back toward the archway, his candle sputtering, his heart hammering in his chest. Lady Ravenscroft did not move to stop him. She only watched, her gray eyes shining in the dark. "You may flee for now," she said softly, her voice carrying through the chamber like a prayer. "But the house is patient. The pact is patient, And when the time comes, you will return here. They all do. Jonathan fled the chamber, the whispers rising behind him, swelling into a cacophony of voices. His steps pounded against the stone, his breath ragged as he climbed the spiral stair. When at last he burst into the manor's upper halls, the air felt no lighter, no safer. The walls still pressed close. The portraits still watched, and somewhere distant. A child's laughter echoed once more. He shut himself in his chamber, bolting the door. Though he knew no lock could keep out the things that moved within Ravenscroft Manor. The parchment trembled in his hands, his own name etched like a verdict. He thought of Eleanor, of Alaric, of all who had come before him. The house had chosen him. And no matter how desperately he might deny it, the shadows had already claimed his soul. Jonathan awoke the next morning to a silence so complete it felt suffocating. The manor, which had seemed to breathe and whisper throughout the night, now lay still. For a moment, he almost believed it had been a dream. The shadows, the altar, the list with his name. But the parchment still rested where he had dropped it on the floor, its letters as sharp and dark as dried blood. His hand shook when he picked it up, but he could not bring himself to destroy it. Part of him feared that burning it might not erase his name, but confirm it. He dressed quickly and resolved to leave. Whatever scholarly interest had brought him here, whatever promises of discovery or wealth had bound him to Lady Ravenscroft's invitation, none of it outweighed the dread gnawing at his soul. He imagined the crisp air of the moors, the open road stretching away from the manor, the safety of distance. He would abandon the study, abandon the commission, let another historian pry into the Ravenscroft legacy. He only wanted to survive, but when he descended the grand staircase with his satchel, he found Lady Ravenscroft waiting in the hall. She stood near the door as though she had known his intent, her pale hands folded before her. Sunlight spilled weakly through the stained glass, painting her face with fractured color. Yet her eyes were untouched, gray, piercing, fixed entirely upon him. "Leaving so soon, Mr. Hale?" she asked, her tone neither surprised nor offended. "The archives are vast. Surely your work is not finished." Jonathan tried to steady his voice. "I've seen enough. Your history is darker than I imagined. I cannot, will not, be a part of it." Her lips curved in something that was not quite a smile. "You speak as though the choice is yours. The house has shown you its heart. Few outsiders are permitted such a gift. Do you think you can walk away now carrying the knowledge it has given you?" He tightened his grip on the satchel. "Knowledge is not worth my life." Lady Ravenscroft tilted her head. "Perhaps not. But is ignorance worth your soul?" The words chilled him. He could not answer, and she did not press him. Instead, she stepped aside, gesturing toward the door with one graceful hand. "Go then if you must. The road is open." Jonathan hesitated only a moment before seizing the chance. He pushed open the heavy door and stepped into the morning fog. The air was damp and cold, but it was free of the manor's suffocating weight. He hurried down the path, gravel crunching beneath his boots, the gate visible through the mist. His chest loosened with relief until he noticed the silence. No bird sang. No wind stirred. Even his footsteps seemed swallowed by the fog. He reached the gate and pushed it open, the iron screeching on its hinges. Beyond lay the moors, vast and empty. He stepped through, only to find himself standing once again at the foot of the grand staircase inside the manor. His satchel slipped from his grasp. Jonathan stumbled back, his mind reeling. He had not turned. He had not retraced his steps. And yet here he was, back within the house's embrace. The doors behind him were shut, the fog gone as though it had never been. The silence was replaced by the faintest whisper rising from the walls. Lady Ravenscroft still stood where he had left her. This time she did smile. "You see now, the house does not release those it has claimed." Jonathan's legs weakened, but he forced himself upright. "Why me? Why not the villagers? The servants? Why bring me here?" Her gaze softened, though her expression was no less unsettling. "Because you listen. Because you write. The pact demands not only blood, but memory. What is sacrifice without remembrance? You are here to record, Mr. Hale, to give voice to what others will not speak. That is your offering." He wanted to deny her, to rage, but the truth was heavier than defiance. She was right. He had listened. He had read. He had written. The house had marked him long before he realized it. That night, Jonathan could not bring himself to sleep. He wandered the halls, desperate for air, for clarity, for any glimpse of escape. His steps carried him to the eastern wing, a place he had not yet explored. Here the air was colder, the stones damp with moss. Doors lined the corridor, each one identical, each closed. He tried the first. Inside was a small chamber, its walls lined with shelves. Upon them rested objects, a child's wooden toy, a silver locket, a blood-stained ribbon. Relics, each bearing a weight of sorrow. He picked up the locket and opened it to find a miniature portrait of a young woman, Eleanor, perhaps. Her painted eyes gazed at him with silent plea, and he returned it quickly to its place. The second room held bones, not arranged, not buried, but piled carelessly as though discarded. Some were small, some large, all brittle with age. Jonathan's stomach twisted. He closed the door before the whispers could rise too loud. The third room was worse. Here the walls were scratched with fingernail marks, deep grooves gouged into the stone. Words etched in desperation. No more. Forgive me, it hurts. Jonathan staggered back, bile rising in his throat. He shut the door but could not erase the memory. At the end of the corridor stood a final door, larger than the rest. He hesitated, candle flickering in his trembling hand. Then he pushed it open. Inside was a vast chamber, circular, its ceiling lost in shadow. In the center stood a pit, ringed with iron railings, from which rose a sound unlike any he had heard before. It was not whispering, not laughter, not even screams, but all of them at once, a chorus of suffering and ecstasy. He leaned over the railing and saw only darkness below, shifting as though alive. Wings rustled, claws scraped, voices cried. The pit was bottomless, a wound in the world itself. Jonathan stumbled back, nearly dropping his candle. The voices rose, forming words this time, though countless mouths spoke them at once. Feed, remember, endure. He fled the chamber, slamming the door, his heart hammering so loud it drowned the whispers for a moment. But they returned, always returned, filling the halls, pressing into his mind. When at last he reached his own room, he collapsed against the door, chest heaving. He knew then with certainty what Lady Ravenscroft had meant. He could not leave. The house had claimed him. He was not merely a guest, but part of its legacy now, bound to its hunger, bound to its memory. And somewhere in the darkness of the manor, something with wings stirred, as though it had heard his surrender. Jonathan's candle had burned to a nub before he finally drifted into uneasy sleep. The whispers did not cease when he closed his eyes. Instead, they invaded his dreams, weaving visions of the manor's past into his restless mind. He saw the banquet hall filled with revelers centuries ago, their laughter bright until it curdled into screams. He saw Alaric Ravenscroft standing before the black altar, a raven perched upon his shoulder, his eyes gleaming with unholy fire. He saw Eleanor, pale and trembling, dragged into the chamber below, her wedding dress trailing through the filth as shadows closed around her. Jonathan awoke with a cry, drenched in sweat. Morning had come again, though it offered no comfort. The light that filtered through the curtains was gray and sickly, as though filtered through ash. His body trembled, his throat parched. Yet he could not shake the sense that the dream had not ended, that he still lingered in the Ravenscroft story, a prisoner of its memory. He forced himself to rise and decided that if he could not escape, he would at least uncover the full truth. Knowledge had always been his tool, his weapon. Perhaps it could yet save him. He returned to the library, that endless tomb of books and relics, and sought the darkest volumes once more. He found a collection of journals bound in cracked leather, written in the hand of various Ravenscroft heirs. They did not deny the pact. They celebrated it. One spoke of crops that flourished even in blight, of coffers filled when kingdoms fell. Another detailed how enemies of the family vanished, their bodies never found, their names stricken from history. Each generation, it seemed, made its offering to the shadows, and each was rewarded. But the journals revealed more than obedience. They revealed fear, Many heirs confessed their dread of the pit below the manor, where the whispers were strongest. They spoke of figures seen in mirrors, of children born with eyes too dark, of wives who disappeared. Some raved about the raven mark, the curse etched into flesh from birth. Others admitted to madness, unable to bear the voices that grew louder with each passing year. One entry chilled Jonathan most of all. It was dated less than a century ago, penned by a man named Thomas Ravencroft. "The house will not let me go. I have tried to flee, but the roads bend back. I have tried to resist, but the pact claims me still. I fear it will claim my daughter next. She bears the mark. God help her. She hears the whispers already." Jonathan slammed the journal shut, his heart racing. A daughter. Could that child still walk the halls now, her presence echoing through the centuries? He thought of the pale girl he had seen, silent, gray-eyed, marked by the raven at her throat. The sound of footsteps broke his thoughts. He looked up to see Lady Ravencroft standing at the threshold of the library, her hands folded, her expression unreadable. "You pry deeper than most," she said softly. The others preferred comfort. "You prefer truth. That is why the house chose you." Jonathan's voice cracked. "That girl, who is she? A ghost? A memory?" Lady Ravencroft's lips curved faintly. "She is both. She is the past that lingers and the future that waits. She walks between. You should not fear her, though you may pity her." He wanted to demand answers, but her gaze silenced him. She crossed the room and laid her hand upon one of the journals he had opened. You read of their fear, of their struggle, yet still they obeyed. Do you know why? Because the alternative was worse. The pact cannot be denied, Mr. Hale. To refuse it is not to be free, it is to be consumed. Jonathan shook his head. You speak of obedience as though it were survival, but it is only surrender. Your family sold its soul for power, and now you call it destiny. Her eyes hardened, though her voice remained calm. And yet you are here. And yet you read. And yet the house whispers your name. Deny it all you wish. The pact has already taken root. She left him then, her gown trailing like mist as she vanished into the corridor. Jonathan sat frozen, the journal heavy in his hands, his breath shallow. He knew she was right in one sense. The house had marked him. But another part of him still fought, still clawed for escape. That night, unable to endure the library's suffocating silence, Jonathan wandered again. His feet carried him to the great hall, where moonlight spilled through tall windows, casting long shadows across the stone floor. He stood alone in the vast chamber, staring at the portraits of generations past. The painted eyes seemed to follow him, their gazes heavy with judgment, with expectation. Then, from the far corner of the hall, came a sound. The creak of a door. Jonathan turned, candle held high, and saw the child again. She stood half in shadow, her face pale, her eyes glimmering with sorrow. She raised her hand and beckoned him silently. His instincts screamed to flee, but his feet moved of their own accord. He followed her through the corridors deeper and deeper until they reached a narrow stair. She descended without a sound, her small figure swallowed by the dark, and Jonathan followed. The stair ended in a chamber he had not seen before. Unlike the others, this room was not filled with bones or relics, but with mirrors. Tall, narrow, stretching from floor to ceiling, they lined the walls in endless reflection. Jonathan saw himself multiplied 100-fold, his candlelight splintered into infinite flickers. The child stopped at the center and pointed to one mirror in particular. Jonathan approached, breath shallow. At first he saw only his reflection, pale and drawn, his eyes wide with fear. But then the image shifted. His reflection's lips moved, though he himself was silent. The voice that came was not his own, but the chorus of whispers, speaking as one. You are chosen. You will endure. You will feed. Jonathan stumbled back, nearly dropping the candle. The mirrors shivered, their surfaces rippling like water. From within, hands pressed against the glass, thin, pale, clawed. Faces appeared, twisted in agony and hunger. The whispers swelled until they became screams, filling the chamber with unbearable sound. The child stood still, her eyes locked on him, her expression sorrowful. Then, with a voice like a sigh, she spoke for the first time. It never ends. The mirrors shattered. Jonathan fell to the floor, covering his face as shards rained around him. The candle extinguished, plunging the chamber into darkness. When he dared to lift his head, the child was gone. Only the whispers remained, louder than ever, filling every corner of the manor, pressing into his very soul. He understood then. There was no escape, no breaking of the pact. The Ravencroft curse was eternal, and he was bound to it now as surely as any blood heir. And somewhere deep within, a terrible realization took root. Part of him no longer feared it. Part of him was beginning to listen. The manor did not sleep. Even in the dead of night, when silence should have reigned, Ravencroft seemed to pulse with a rhythm of its own, as though the very stones carried a heartbeat. Jonathan lay awake, staring at the ceiling beams above, listening to the low murmur of whispers that never ceased. They did not frighten him as sharply as before. Worse, they fascinated him now, threading into his thoughts with a kind of sinister intimacy. He had begun to recognize patterns, fragments of words, even names. The house was teaching him its language, and he feared what would happen once he understood it fully. By dawn, his body trembled with exhaustion, but his mind burned with a hunger he had never felt. He needed answers, not vague hints, not cryptic whispers, but truth. If he was to be prisoner of the pact, he would at least know its depths. He dressed, lit a lantern, and descended once more into the lower halls, determined to confront the darkness on its own ground. The corridors shifted as before, but this time Jonathan followed their design without panic. He no longer resisted the house's guidance. Instead, he let it lead him. The walls seemed to bend subtly, steering him past familiar doors until he reached an archway he had not seen. Carved above it was the raven sigil, deeper and more intricate than any he had found. The lantern flame guttered, but he pressed on, his heart pounding with equal parts dread and anticipation. Beyond lay a chamber unlike the others. It was vast and circular, its walls lined not with bones or relics, but with shelves stacked high with tomes, scrolls, and ledgers. A library beneath the manor, hidden and secret, older than the house itself. The air was thick with the scent of dust and ink, yet the books were preserved, their bindings strong, their pages unyellowed. Jonathan set his lantern on a stone table and pulled the first volume he touched. It was a ledger, its entries written in a precise hand. The dates stretched back centuries. Each entry recorded a name, an offering, and the result. Some were villagers, others strangers, still others members of the family itself. The outcomes were chillingly methodical. Prosperity of crops ensured, gold multiplied, illness averted, rivals silenced. The offerings had bought everything from wealth to revenge. Each paid in blood. Jonathan opened another tome. This one was less orderly, a journal filled with frantic scrawlings. The writer spoke of a voice in the pit, a god cloaked in feathers, who demanded to be remembered through sacrifice. "It is no demon," the journal insisted. "It is older than demons. It is hunger made flesh. It rewards as it devours. It whispers as it waits." The words blurred before Jonathan's eyes, his skin prickling. He could almost hear the voice himself now, not in the distance but close, curling around him like smoke. His hands shook as he pulled another book, then another, devouring the knowledge. He read of Alaric's first pact, of the rituals that bound each generation, of the raven mark that appeared upon chosen heirs. He read of Eleanor's disappearance, confirmed at last as sacrifice, her blood sealing a century of fortune. He read of heirs who resisted, always silenced, their bodies devoured by the pit. Hours passed unnoticed. Jonathan's lantern sputtered low, but he did not care. He was consumed by the histories, the testimonies, the endless cycle of devotion and death. At last, he opened a slender book bound in black leather. Unlike the others, its script was finer, elegant. The name on the first page froze his breath. Thomas Ravencroft. The man he had read of earlier, the one who feared for his daughter. The journal began with resignation. "The pact cannot be undone. I have tried, and the house bends against me. Yet I cannot surrender my child. She is innocent, though the mark is hers. If she must be given, let it be with my life in place of hers." Jonathan's pulse quickened. The pages that followed grew darker. Thomas wrote of his attempts to deceive the house, offering strangers in place of kin, falsifying rituals, whispering prayers to a god that never answered. At last his entries grew desperate. The house knows. The shadows know. It will take her still. It will take me too. Forgive me, my child. Forgive me. The journal ended in jagged script, the ink smudged as though written in haste. Jonathan turned the last page and felt his stomach twist. A small lock of hair was pressed between the sheets, pale and brittle with age. A child's hair? He dropped the book, bile rising in his throat. The girl, the one he had seen in the halls, silent, sorrowful. Could she be the daughter Thomas had tried to save? Bound not by death but by the house itself, caught forever between shadow and memory? A sound stirred in the chamber then, a rustle of feathers, though no bird was near. The lantern flame flared and dimmed. Jonathan froze, his breath shallow, as a shape coiled in the shadows at the chamber's edge. It was not fully formed, but he felt its presence, vast and suffocating. Wings beat softly in the darkness, though no wind touched him. And a voice spoke, not from the shadows, not from the walls, but inside his mind. You read. You remember. You serve. Jonathan staggered, clutching his head. The voice was neither male nor female, neither loud nor soft, but it filled him utterly. His thoughts bent beneath it. His will faltered. He tried to resist, to cry out, but the words came unbidden to his lips. What do you want of me? The voice answered, a chorus of hunger. Feed. Write. Endure. The chamber darkened further, the shelves vanishing into shadow, the books dissolving like smoke. Only the altar of his memory remained, black and glistening, and the pit, bottomless and alive. The whispers rose, joining the voice until they became a storm, echoing with names, screams, prayers. Jonathan dropped to his knees, the weight of centuries pressing upon him. He did not know how long he remained there. When he opened his eyes, the chamber was gone. He was once again in the Manor's library, the black volume resting before him, its raven sigil gleaming faintly. His lantern was nearly out, the wax melted to a stub. Had it been hours or days? Jonathan pressed his hands to his face, trembling. The house had not merely shown him history, it had made him part of it. He carried the knowledge now, the burden of remembrance, the curse of the Ravencrofts. He knew the truth of the pact, the hunger that demanded offerings, the futility of resistance, and yet deep within him a darker thought coiled. The pact offered more than suffering. It offered power, wealth, endurance. The Ravencrofts had thrived while others perished. They had bent kingdoms to their will. If he was bound, if he was chosen, could he not claim the same? Jonathan shuddered at the thought, horrified at himself. But the whispers caressed him, soft as silk, urging, tempting. Feed, remember, endure. He stumbled to his feet, desperate for air, for silence, for escape. But as he reached the library door, he realized what he already knew. There was no escape. The house had claimed him. The pact had begun its work, and Jonathan Hale, historian and prisoner, was no longer certain he wanted to resist. The days blurred into one another within the walls of Ravencroft Manor, though Jonathan could no longer measure them in any ordinary sense. Time seemed to fold and warp, hours stretching into eternities, then collapsing into moments. He did not know whether it was dawn or dusk when he wandered the halls, for the windows showed only a shifting gloom, pale light one moment and shadow the next. Sleep came rarely, and when it did, it brought no rest, only visions of feathers, of black wings that brushed against his skin, of voices that filled his mind with promises and commands. The manor had begun to change around him. At first it was subtle. The arrangement of the corridors altered, doors appeared where none had been, the paintings shifted slightly when he passed. But as the days passed, the changes grew bolder. The portraits no longer depicted silent faces but watched him openly, their mouths curling into sneers or thin smiles of recognition. The whispers became louder, not confined to the stones but spilling into the very air, so that Jonathan sometimes found himself speaking back to them without realizing it. He was not alone here, not anymore, and perhaps he never had been. Lady Ravenscroft appeared seldom now, though her presence lingered like a perfume in the halls. When she did come, she regarded him with a calmness that unnerved him. "You see more clearly now," she said one evening, her voice like velvet, her eyes glinting with something between triumph and pity. "The house has opened itself to you. That is a gift." Jonathan wanted to protest, to insist that he was still his own man, but the words caught in his throat. The truth was bitter. The house had opened itself to him, and he had not turned away. Each secret revealed had become a lure, pulling him deeper. He thought of the journals, the records of sacrifices, the dark voice in the hidden chamber. He thought of the child who haunted the halls, her mournful eyes fixed upon him as if pleading for him to understand. And he thought of himself, how he listened now when the whisper spoke, how he traced the raven sigil in idle moments, how he no longer recoiled from the shadows that slithered near. That night, he returned to the underground chamber where the mirrors had shattered. The broken glass still lay scattered across the floor, each fragment reflecting his face in twisted distortion. He knelt among them, staring into the pieces, searching for something, truth perhaps, or recognition. Instead, he saw only multiplicity, countless versions of himself, each bearing a slightly different expression. Some were fearful, others resigned. Some looked almost eager. As he studied them, the air grew cold. The shards trembled on the floor, vibrating with unseen energy. Jonathan's breath caught as, one by one, the reflections moved independently of him. The other selves leaned closer, their mouths opening, their voices spilling into the chamber in perfect unison. Feed. Remember. Endure. He clamped his hands over his ears, but the sound was not external. It bloomed inside his skull, a chorus of his own voice twisted into the will of the pact. He shouted, begging it to stop, but the echoes rose, drowning his protests. When he staggered back, his palm landed on a shard of glass, cutting deep. Blood welled bright against the floor. At once, the voices hushed. The blood dripped into the cracks between the stones, and the manor itself seemed to sigh, a long, shuddering exhalation of satisfaction. Jonathan's wound throbbed, but more disturbing than the pain was the response. The house had accepted it. His blood was offering enough for now. He pressed his hand to his chest, shaking. It would not end, he realized. The manor would take what it wanted, blood, flesh, soul, until there was nothing left of him but whispers in the dark. And yet beneath the terror, a terrible pride sparked. The house had recognized him. He was part of the pact now, woven into its legacy as surely as Alaric, Thomas, Eleanor, and all the rest. He fled the chamber, but the whispers followed, gentler now, coaxing. They did not demand in that moment, they promised. Visions unfurled in his mind, gold piled high in vaults, power that bent kings and queens to his will, knowledge forbidden to other men. He saw himself standing tall, cloaked in shadow, his eyes gleaming like those in the portraits. He saw generations yet to come, speaking his name with reverence and fear. In the days that followed, the house tested him. Servants, phantoms of the past, or conjurations of the pact, appeared with trays of food, though he had not seen them before. He ate without question, though the meat was dark and strange, the wine bitter with iron. He walked corridors that stretched for miles, opening doors into ballrooms where faceless figures danced in silence, their steps perfectly synchronized. He witnessed rituals played out in endless repetition, sacrifices of centuries past reenacted for his eyes alone. The child appeared more often, too. She would not come near, but watched him from across halls, from staircases, from the edge of candlelight. Her gray eyes were full of sorrow, and her lips formed silent words he could not hear. Sometimes she raised her hand as if in warning, and Jonathan felt a pang of pity so sharp it nearly broke through the haze the house wove around him. But then the whispers would rise again, drowning out her silent plea, and the pity curdled into something else, impatience perhaps, or denial. One evening, he found himself in the great hall once more, standing beneath the portraits. His candle flickered low, but he did not need its light. The eyes of his ancestors gleamed brightly on their own, illuminating the chamber. For the first time, Jonathan did not feel their gaze as judgment. He felt it as welcome. "You are one of us now," the portraits seemed to say, though no lips moved. He spoke, his voice low but steady. "If I am chosen, then what must I do?" The answer came not from the portraits, but from the house itself, the voice swelling around him like a tide. "You will remember. You will feed. You will endure. The pact is eternal." Jonathan bowed his head, the weight of acceptance pressing upon him. He no longer fought the whispers. He listened. He no longer recoiled from the hunger. He felt it within himself. The historian who had come seeking truth was gone. In his place stood something new, something bound, something willing, something claimed. The manor had not devoured him yet. It had molded him. And Jonathan Hale, once an outsider, was now a Ravencroft in all but name. As the candle died, leaving him in shadow, Jonathan whispered the words back to the darkness, sealing his place in the legacy. "You are one of us now," the portrait seemed to say. Though no lips moved, he spoke, his voice low but steady. "If I am chosen, then what must I do?" The answer came not from the portraits, but from the house itself, the voice swelling around him like a tide. "You will remember. You will feed. You will endure. The pact is eternal." Jonathan bowed his head, the weight of acceptance pressing upon him. He no longer fought the whispers. He listened. He no longer recoiled from the hunger. He felt it within himself. The historian who had come seeking truth was gone. In his place stood something new, something bound, something willing, something claimed. The manor had not devoured him yet. It had molded him. And Jonathan Hale, once an outsider, was now a Ravencroft in all but name. As the candle died, leaving him in shadow, Jonathan whispered the words back to the darkness, sealing his place in the legacy. "Feed. Remember. Endure." The storm broke over Ravencroft Manor with a violence that seemed summoned, lightning splitting the sky into jagged fragments, thunder rolling like cannon fire across the cliffs. Rain lashed against the tall windows, streaming down the glass as though the heavens themselves wept for the cursed estate. Jonathan stood at the heart of the great hall, his body rigid, his mind a maelstrom. The portraits glared down at him, their painted eyes alive with expectation, their lips almost moving in silent command. He was no longer merely a guest, no longer an intruder. He was heir to the whispers, bound to the pact. The house groaned with each peal of thunder as though alive and restless. Shadows writhed along the walls, elongating and twisting into shapes that resembled wings, talons, faces. The voices that had haunted Jonathan for weeks surged together now into clarity, their chorus deafening in his skull. It is time. The offering must be made. The pact must be fed. His breath came shallow, his hands trembling. He had resisted once, clinging to the notion of escape, of breaking free. But the manor had worn him down piece by piece until his defiance was threadbare. Now only choice remained, sacrifice or surrender. And deep within, a terrible truth settled. He no longer feared surrender. The child appeared then, her pale form standing at the top of the grand staircase. Her gray eyes shimmered with sorrow, her small hands clasped before her. She shook her head slowly, pleading without words. Jonathan felt the ache of her gaze, the weight of her silent warning. He wanted to reach for her, to demand her truth, to beg her for salvation. Yet the voices roared louder, drowning her out, commanding him toward the depths below. The doors to the banquet hall swung open on their own. A cold draft swept through, extinguishing the candles one by one until only lightning illuminated the space. Jonathan felt his feet move without conscious thought, drawn forward as though the floor itself propelled him. The child turned away, fading like mist, leaving him to the path alone. He crossed the hall and descended the winding stair into the catacombs. The air grew thicker with each step, heavy with damp and the coppery tang of old blood. The whispers grew clearer, more distinct now, names of the dead, chants of the pact, promises of power eternal. Jonathan's lantern sputtered and went dark, yet the path glowed faintly ahead. Lit by the phosphorescence of the stones themselves, at last, he reached the black altar, slick and gleaming as though freshly polished. The pit yawned before it, bottomless, a wound in the earth. From its depths rose a sound that was not mere whisper, but the echo of wings beating in the dark. A presence surged upward, filling the chamber, pressing against Jonathan's skin like invisible hands. His knees buckled and he fell before the altar, trembling. The voice came vast and inescapable. "You have read. You have seen. You have endured. Now you will give." Jonathan's throat was dry, his words barely more than a croak. What must I give?" The answer unfurled like smoke. "Your blood, your name, your soul. You are Ravencroft now. You are the heir of the pact." The altar pulsed with a dark light, and Jonathan felt the cut on his hand reopen, blood dripping onto the stone. The pit below shivered, the shadows writhing like serpents. His mind screamed against the inevitability, yet his body leaned forward, compelled. He pressed his palm flat against the altar, smearing it with his blood. The chamber erupted with sound. Screams of centuries past echoed through the stone, the cries of the sacrificed mingling with the laughter of those who prospered from their deaths. Jonathan saw visions flood his mind. Alaric striking the first bargain, Eleanor dragged to her doom, Thomas begging for his daughter's life. He saw faces upon faces, generations of Ravencrofts, all bound by the same chain of hunger and obedience. And now, his own face joined theirs, etched into the endless tapestry of the cursed line. The voice swelled, triumphant. "Feed, remember, endure." Jonathan gasped, his body racked with both agony and ecstasy. He felt the shadows crawl into his veins, filling him with cold fire. The hunger of the pact was no longer outside him. It was within. He was both servant and master now, bound and empowered. The whispers no longer tormented, they obeyed. The manor no longer resisted him, it welcomed him. The storm raged above, shaking the foundations, but Jonathan rose to his feet, steady and unafraid. His eyes gleamed in the darkness, no longer entirely his own. He stood tall before the altar, his voice firm as he spoke the words that sealed his place in the pact. "I am Ravencroft. I remember. I feed. I endure." The pit below responded with a rush of air, hot and fetid like the exhalation of a great beast. The shadows bent toward him, bowing. For the first time since his arrival, Jonathan did not feel trapped. He felt exalted, and yet, from the corner of the chamber, he saw her again. The child, her pale face luminous in the dark. She shook her head once more, her lips forming a single word, "Never." Then she faded into nothing, leaving only the echo of her sorrow. Jonathan's heart twisted for a moment, but the hunger drowned it quickly. Whatever her warning, it was too late. He was no longer merely Jonathan Hale, historian and seeker of truth. He was heir to the darkness, keeper of the pact, master of the whispers. Above, the storm broke into silence as though the world itself acknowledged his ascension. The manor grew still, the shadows retreating to their corners, the portraits in the hall settling into quiet watchfulness. But within Jonathan, the storm raged on, eternal and insatiable. He turned from the altar, climbing the stairs back toward the world above. His footsteps echoed with new weight, the house shifting to accommodate him, to honor him. Every stone, every whisper, every shadow bent to his will now. When he reached the great hall, the candles relit themselves. The portraits no longer sneered or judged. They nodded in grim approval. Lady Ravencroft appeared once more, her eyes shining. She bowed her head, not in pity but in deference. "Welcome home," she whispered. Jonathan stood beneath the gaze of his new ancestors, the pact coursing through his blood, and knew the truth with finality. There was no escape, no redemption, no end. The Ravencroft curse had claimed him utterly, and though part of him still mourned, another part, the greater part, rejoiced. The history of the Ravencrofts had gained a new chapter. And Jonathan Hale would not be remembered as a victim. He would be remembered as the one who embraced the darkness, who became it. The whispers rose again, not as torment, but as hymn, carrying his name through the manor, through the centuries to come. Jonathan Ravencroft. Feed. Remember. Endure.